I played the most overpowered build in Diablo 4. Yep, Quill Volley Spiritborn. Everyone's doing it, I'm doing it, now I'm going to talk about it. So first up, why did I play the super OP thing? Because I find playing OP things fun, and it's probably not going to stick around until next season, so might as well play it while it still lasts. Second of all, as fun as Evade Spiritborn was, as good of a starter as it was, even before it got nerfed, I just wasn't really feeling it. Because especially as you got to endgame encounters, actually controlling your character and positioning was kind of a pain when you're constantly evading. So I swapped over to Quill Volley, had absolutely no issues at all, and began obliterating everything on the screen. Is this build OP? Yes, you auto shotgun everything. If you're using Aterials, you are basically immortal. Pretty darn tanky even without one. And you have functionally infinite damage. We're talking about orders of magnitudes above other builds. In fact, it does so much damage that I'm pretty sure you could square the damage done by some builds, and it would still be lower than a fully min-maxed damage-optimized version of this character. That said, because the damage is so high, and because personally I have no desire to push super high pit levels, I have not optimized for damage. Instead, I'm playing a version that focuses more on quality of life and defenses, since it's still going to destroy all the content I'm putting it against. The basic gameplay loop is pretty simple. Hold down your Quill Volley button. When all of your other buttons light up, hit them to keep the buffs active. If the Ravager buff is already active, you don't need to hit that button even when it lights up, as kills do extend the Ravager duration. But there are two very important key mechanics that require a little bit more explanation. The first is Rod of Kapaleki and Ring of Midnight Sun. Your goal of the setup is to use Kapaleki to spend all of your resources on every attack, and use Ring of the Midnight Sun to get all of those resources back on every attack. To do this, you need, at minimum, 100% resource generation. Since resource generation stats are multiplicative rather than simply additive, even though 100% sounds like a big number, it is definitely achievable. You can get this via things like a temper on your other ring, and replenishing Ravager, and nodes on your Paragon board. The exact combination of these things does vary a bit from character to character, and while you need 100% with a perfect 50% ring, you may need significantly more if your ring is worse. There's quite a bit of math behind this, so the solution that I went for is just farm until I got a perfect Ring of the Midnight Sun. That way I didn't really have to do very much at all. But if you're curious, you want to dive into it, I'll link to a resource down below that goes into all the details. Next up, for the overpowered version of a build to work, you need a Banished Lord's Talisman, and you need to have 275 base skill cost. This starts at 40 for Quill Volley, which means you need 235 max vigor before the build starts working. You can get this from your Rod of Kapaleki, from your Menagerie glyph in the sapping board, and fill in the rest with either Tybalt's Will or Harlequin Crest. The exact way to achieve this does depend on your glyph level. It does depend on if your Kapaleki's GA resource, what you end up hitting for your masterworks, all that stuff. But when you're doing overpower, your max life and fortify help to scale the damage, so you want as much life as possible. Part of that you can get from Rehair, but alternatively you can use the assimilation aspect, since you have a pretty decent chance to dodge from payback. Rehair's is fully passive, whereas the assimilation aspect allows it to stack up much more quickly, as you're going to be frequently dodging in combat, especially if you're face tanking stuff. Now personally, as I mentioned, I did go for a more defensive version of a build, but if you want a more offensive version, the short version is you stack as much maximum resolve as possible to maximize the value of the aspect of interdiction, which in turn maximizes the damage bonus from aspect of redirected force. This will result in significantly higher DPS and significantly higher pit clears, but you can't really use Aterials with it, so you will be notably squishier. That said, if you don't have Aterials, there's really no reason not to go with the resolve stacking version. And so now, with that out of the way, let's get into some of the choices made when it comes to the rest of the build. So first up, let's start with Spirit Hall, Mercenaries, and Skills. Under Spirit Hall, the main hall used is Jaguar. Every 15th time you deal direct damage, you unleash an additional strike for 15% of the damage you dealt to them in the last 0.5 seconds. In other words, this is just a huge damage multiplier that triggers constantly. The secondary haul is Gorilla for maximum resolve +2 and permanent unstoppable. Now, resolve stacking is its own version of this build. It is not something I'm doing currently because I prefer the extra defenses from materials, and it's a little harder to work materials into the resolve stacking version. Though when I talk about the gearing, I will talk about some alternatives that kind of let you do a hybrid between the two. Next up, we have Mercenaries. Hired Mercenary Rehair. Why? Number 1, easy armor cap. Number 2, free hits. You can take what would otherwise be a fatal blow or absorb massive amount of damage from a boss in the pit. Maybe do something like stand in a lethal boss mechanic on a tormented fight. Either way, it's really good. The number 3, Fortify and the Shield Charge, which helps you scale your fortification so that you can maximize your overpower damage. Oh, and also his skills do help build the stagger meter, which is nice for bosses, but definitely not why we're using it. Then Varanya, basically just Earthbreaker, knocks enemies down repeatedly. It's a free proc that builds up stagger, and right now I have it on my Armored Hide. Doesn't really matter what I put it on, because I'm pressing all the buttons all the time. Quill Volley, Armored Hide, whatever you spam, just don't put it on Ravager, because that's the thing you might not hit that often. So, let's go into skills here. First up, Rock Splitter with Enhanced Rock Splitter. But you need to put 2 points somewhere, so that's where they are. Next up, Quill Volley, obviously max ranks out. This is where most of your damage comes from. Advantageous Quill Volley because it's better for single target, and let's be honest, the build does not need help clearing. Then of course, over here, Balance Exertion. Skills cost more vigor, doesn't really matter, and deal 15% multiplicative damage, which does matter, because of course, you're spending all your vigor, you're doing all the damage. Coming down here, Vortex with Measured Vortex. This is, again, just another way to build that stagger meter. You should always have an active barrier. And you create a cyclone that pulls enemies in. This is really nice for grouping stuff so that you can point blank them. Now, Ravager with Measured Ravager is a great way to get your vigor recovery up. You need enough so that you enable the permanent Kapelecki loop. This is a free 30%, and Measured Ravager should basically be up 100% of the time. For passive skills, on the left, Apex, increased damage to vulnerable enemies, doubled versus elite, so it's basically always doubled when it's relevant. And Unrestrained Power, increased damage while unhindered or unstoppable. Remember, permanent unstoppable. So, permanent, 12% multiplicative. If you are not wearing a Tyrael's, diminishment could also be nice. With Tyrael's, I personally did not feel the need to make enemies deal less damage. I could pretty much tank everything, go to like 3 stacks of a boss debuff in Pit 90. So yeah, I don't think I need extra defenses right now. Then, coming down here, Armored Hide, number 1, it is 100% block, which is really good because that's a damage gain. And number 2, Counterattack. You'll note this is not on the bar. This is really just taken for the reinforced counterattack passive effect, as you are granted the effect of counterattack from your ring. And last up, Scourge for infinite healing. If any part of a build was going to be dropped or adjusted, this is the part that would be dropped or adjusted. Number 1, having enemies feared and run away from you, while it is certainly nice for reducing the damage you take, can make it a little harder to kill them, as, you know, they're running away from you. Number 2, while yes, this does effectively give you infinite healing, you might not need the infinite healing. Then for passives, Perseverance, additional damage reduction per stack of resolve. This is like 15% plus, depending on how many stacks that you actually stack. You could get infinite healing from Fueled as well. Then over here, Auspicious, barrier accumulation is always good, and you need to have at least some sort of barrier. Then we come down to this section, which is basically just potency passives. Resilient, increased max life. More max life means more overpower damage. Brilliance, you want move speed to move around fast, so now it's a damage multiplier. Then over here, this one might not make sense, because after all, Quill Volley is an Eagle skill. But it's actually not just an Eagle skill. It's now a Jaguar skill. And so you get Jaguar skills, increased damage enemies take, 30% multiplier, stacks up almost immediately, and critical strike damage potency per stack of ferocity. You can get quite a few ferocity stacks, so this is also a very potent bonus. And last but certainly not least, the Hunter. It's really good for executing stuff, and it's great for mobility. It's also good for keeping your supremacy active, which is a very powerful damage multiplier that honestly I wouldn't be surprised if it gets nerfed in the future. Then last up for key passives, Prodigy's Tempo. Basically, this is just a Jacketh shell replacement so that you can spam all of your buttons all the time. You're easily able to take advantage of these bonuses just by spamming your Quill Volley, which ensures all of your other cooldowns come up promptly, especially if you have a little bit of CDR on gear. So next up, let's take a quick look at glyphs and Paragon boards. Honestly, if you want to know more about Paragon boards, I highly recommend you look at Woody's guide over at Maxwell GG. That'll have all the details, go over the steps. I'm just going to do a very quick board glyph, go through all of them. So first up, starting board, Fulminate. This is increased lightning damage. It's good against healthy and injured, so you can quickly execute stuff or deal initial damage. This one's really wonky because you enable the bonus with dexterity, so that's what's going to light up all shiny, but the damage actually scales with intelligence. Then next up, Convergence board. Deal bonus damage equal to 20% of your highest bonus damage types. This is relatively easy to stack up. Talon glyph. Your main skill is an eagle skill, so this scales the damage. You get critical strike damage multiplier, lightning damage multiplier. Again, it's really easy to enable this. There's plenty of dexterity and range. As you can see, I have 80 selected out of a 40 required. And the glyph's a fairly high level, but this kicks in as soon as you turn it legendary at level 46 and increase its radius to 5. Next up, Viscous Shield, because of course. This board has a lot of really awesome nodes, legendary effects aside. For example, Slayer for max life and helping to armor cap. Damage reduction while you have a barrier, which you should always have. Damage while you have a barrier. And here we go, just some nice crit damage and dex. Glyph here is Spirit, so causing enemies to take increased damage. Doing damage to elites, always definitely good. That's where you're going to struggle. And then a massive crit strike damage multiplier. Then here we have Sapping. When you cast at least 3 of the same spirit in a row, you restore 15% of your vigor and deal 30% increased damage. Since you're mostly just casting Quill Volley in a row, you should always be doing this at least 3 times within 5 seconds. In fact, you're probably doing this 3 times within 1 second. Then for a glyph, Menagerist. This one requires a little bit more explanation, because the level on Menagerist does very much matter. So, Menagerist is being used to boost the effect of these maximum resource nodes. You need to get to effectively 275 resources spent with every attack in order to enable your amulet, which is crucial to the overpowered version of the build. So as you level the glyph, check on your resources, and feel free to go back and reference the key mechanic where I discussed this in more detail earlier in the video. Last up, Revealing. Chance to knock down vulnerable enemies and dealing damage to crowd-controlled enemies. This is a very nice quality of life board with the Colossal glyph. You deal 2% increased damage for each stack of Resolve you have. This is part of why Giga Resolve stacking is so strong. The current setup that I have only gives about plus 10 max Resolve, but you can get it to like plus 30, which is a lot more damage. So you might want to consider that if you have the gear to support it, if you're pushing the pit. If you're just doing Torment 4, Tormented Bosses, etc., you do not need Resolve stacking. This build is so disgustingly overtuned, it doesn't matter. But in short, if you're going to Resolve stuff, absolutely take Colossal. And yeah, your skills count as Gorilla, so hey, free damage. So now, let's get into some gearing and talking about alternatives. First up, Harmony of Ebewaka. This is great for having the damage reduction, extra defenses. Don't mind the velocity masterwork here, that's just, you know, the 12th one does what the 12th one wants, and it hit the worst possible result, all stats or movement speed or damage reduction. That's what you want to aim for, with damage reduction being the most desirable. So, according to your secondary Spirit Hall choice, in this case Gorilla, all skills are additionally of that type, and they deal increased damage per type they have, which in this case is the full 90% bonus for being an Eagle, Jaguar, Gorilla skill. Now, if you are struggling and want an alternative, I suggest the Shaco or Harlequin Crest with greater affix cooldown reduction. This makes it much easier to maintain all of your skills. It still gives a solid damage reduction. It gives you damage through +4 ranks to all skills, and you can always go for something like Masterworks on the CDR, and really any of the others help, especially because it has max resource, which means you could drop your Tibbles. This is a great alternative, but if you are building around it, your build kind of sort of becomes reliant on it, So I wanted to present a version that did not require any uber uniques, even if they are still very powerful and very effective. So next up, Tyrael's Might. This is very good for capping out resistances and adding a ton of defenses. It is defenses the item. I happen to have greater affix on all res, so I didn't want any masterworks on that. But also, technically, the all res here at 117% is overkill. It should be 1 on all res and then either 1 on max all res, if that's not GA, or 2 on damage reduction. That said, while this is very powerful, it lets you pretty much stand in everything and be giga lazy, but it's not required at all. So, you can wear a rare chest, try to get either GA life or GA defensive skills, and then try to get maximum resolve tempers. That is what enables the non-Tyrael's version, which, by the way, does have higher damage. It's just that you don't have 85% all-res permanently, so you're also much, much squishier. Now, instead of going all the way down the list, I'm going to jump to boots here, because right now, I'm using GA Dex with movement speed, life, and barrier gen. It's imprinted with the duelists for maximum ferocity. But if you are not using Tyrael's, you will need to make up a massive amount of all-res, and there's 2 options. One of them, Yen's Blessing. Casting a skill has a chance to cast a non-mobility, non-ultimate skill that is currently on cooldown. Basically, more buffs, and it has resource gen, which helps you resource gen cap even with a weaker ring, and it has all-res. This is really, really good, especially if you can get one with GA resist all elements. If you can't get this, though, there is yet another alternative, that being Rakanoth's Wake. Gives a ton of all-res, gives cooldown, which is another valuable stat, non-fizz damage, and movement speed. Next up, gloves. My gloves are kind of mediocre, to be honest, mostly because they hate being masterworked. The masterwork really should be on either the maximum life or the Quill Volley, but it hit basic damage, and I've tried like 8 times, and I've kind of just given up. In addition, you want something like attack speed over dex, but dex is fine if you can't find attack speed. I've had these gloves for, honestly, ages. Whether or not you use redirected force here or moonrise doesn't matter. 1 on your gloves, 1 on your ring. That's for this version of a build. If you want to know about the non-Tyrael setup and what legendary aspects to use for max resolve stacking, again, check the guide over on max roll. Quill Volley is a separate multiplier, so you want to get those levels up. Maximum life is a multiplier, but of course, as you get more, it's going to be less effective. And beyond that, attack speed is really good until you hit the cap. Dexterity is also not terrible. It does give multiplicative damage. You just have kind of a lot of it. Then we've got Tybalt's. This could be very important. Could be you don't want it at all. Again, it all depends on if you can get to the correct amount of maximum resource without it. The reason that I'm still using this one is because I hit the near perfect masterworks on it. You know, greater affix life, greater affix res. But ultimately, I do feel like I'm getting to the point where I probably should be swapping things around even more. Going for rare pants. Again, you want defensive stuff, greater affix max life. Try to get those maximum resolve tempers, because that is going to be a great way to continue to scale your damage. Next up, the weapon, Rod of Kepeleki. It gives maximum resource, which is what you want for greater affix on, and you want at least 2 masterworks. This just makes it way easier to do the rest of your gearing, especially if you aren't using a Tybalt's. Then after that, try to get the biggest number possible on the inherent unique power. The word salad for this item essentially reads, do all the damage by spending all the vigor by doing the infinite vigor loop. But yeah, it's really good, and there isn't a replacement. Next up, Banished Lord's Talisman, which should ideally have GA life, but could have GA attack speed or core skills instead. This item is very much mandatory because it's what makes the overpower version work. So your next core skill is guaranteed to overpower after you spend the resources, which you should do on every attack, and your critical strikes that overpower. With Kepeleki, every hit should be a crit, and with Banished Lords, every crit should also overpower. You deal 60% multiplicative damage. Huge boost to DPS. Of course, the other item that makes it really easy to maintain resources is Ring of the Midnight Sun. When you crit, you regain 50% of a vigor. You want to scale this up to actually regain 100% of a vigor. That way, You attack once, you get it back. You attack once, you get it back. In terms of other things that are good on the ring, CDR is the best GA. As you can tell, I don't have that. I don't even have Masterworks on it. I've been using this as a filler ring until I get a good Ancestral, because the Vigor Regain portion is the more important version, especially if you aren't using a Yen's Blessing for your boots. And then last up, a good old ring, in this case, GA Life. Having something like Attack Speed or Dex is also good, Attack Speed being the next best GA behind Life. Then Resource Generation, very, 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 very important. If you don't get that, the entire build does not work. Now, as a note, the basic attack damage temper that I have, not only on my ring, but also on my gloves, that's because I was using both of these items before I was using the Overpower version. Overpower damage scales better and is the ideal option here. It's just something that I didn't have available when I made these, and it feels kind of bad when you finished your item and you can't really go back and change the tempers. You have to drop the same one in whatever rare chance, and then retemper it, then all that stuff, especially when everything's already melting anyway. Last up, Runes and Rune Words. Here, Pakwe. For Voracious Fortress, spend 300% of maximum resource. In other words, attack 3 times to get Earthen Bulwark, another very nice barrier. And down here, Zalzal. Forbidden Titanic Strength. Whenever you invoke that barrier, you charge up to gain 20% of your maximum life for 6 seconds, with increased duration for Overflow. This should charge up very quickly because you are constantly spending 300% of your maximum resource, thus invoking another class's skill. One last note on gems. Very much go for Dexterity here for the extra multipliers. But here, you may want armor from the skulls. You may want resistances from the diamonds. It all depends on what the rolls are on the rest of your gear. Right now, I have a lot of extra resistances from materials, so I went with skulls and solved my armor here. But let's say I wasn't using materials and I had an armor roll on my chest, then I might go with a diamond in my ring, as that solves res, and I already have the armor that I need. The reason it's slightly low here is because the rest of the bonus is coming from Rehair. Alright, so you probably didn't need me to tell you that Quill Volley is good. Yeah, it's really good. You can destroy Uber bosses in fractions of a second. You can run through the Undercity, even with a unique tribute, as if it simply didn't exist. And you can push the pit to ridiculous levels. My gear is in no way optimized for damage. I'm able to speed farm pit 90, and I'm able to comfortably do pit 110. I'm sure I could push another 10, 20 tiers higher in the pit if I started to go resolve stacking and optimize my gear for damage. But honestly, I just don't care about doing that. Sure, it could, but I'm never going to compete on the leaderboards anyway, so the end result is, why not just sit back, relax, and make the experience more enjoyable? Which is why I have focused as much as possible on getting my defenses to the point where I can just face tank anything. When I farm Infernal Hordes, yep, I can just face tank anything. When I'm doing the pit, in the 90s, I don't really even have to dodge the bosses. Sure, I'll start taking amplified damage, but that doesn't matter. It doesn't hit hard enough to kill me before I kill the boss. And out in the open world, tormented bosses, etc., I think the only one that can kill me at this point is Andariel, because her phases are super annoying, and even then it takes quite a bit of effort before she's actually able to do anything. And a lot of that is largely due to materials when combined with the life stacking. The more health you have, the more effective your damage reductions are. The more health you have, the more effective your resistances are, because these things give you more time to heal up after you take damage, and they give you a bigger effective health pool, which means you won't get one-shot as easily. Now, there is always a balance. If you had 10,000 life but no damage reduction, no resistances, you'd die very, very quickly. On the other hand, if you have a ton of res, ton of damage reduction, but you only have like 2k life, you're still going to die very quickly. You need both. And personally, I felt like around 4.5k was when the build started to feel tanky. The minute I put on material, I jumped up to like 6k life because I swapped around my gear. That's when it felt immortal. And now I'm at almost 10,000 life. So how immortal do I feel? Yes, I stayed at everything and I make no effort to move out of stuff. Monsters can move away from me. Actually, no, they can't. I'll vortex them back in. So in short, it's been quite fun to experience God mode. And the build's pretty darn fast for clearing out in the open world as well. But no, I don't think this build is healthy for the game, and I would generally be surprised if it stuck around in its current form in future seasons. But that said, it does so much more damage than everything else that even if it got nerfed by 99%, it would be one of, if not the strongest builds to exist in the game. With all of that said, if you want to read about the build in more details, go ahead and check out Woody's guide over on Maxroll. Now normally when playing a build, even if I take inspiration from a guide, I put my own twist on it. I change stuff based on my own preferences. In this case, there wasn't really that much to change. It feels like, because of the build's popularity, this one's pretty much solved. So that'll be linked down below. Also, if you want something to get started, I do think the Evade Spiritborn is still perfectly playable. It's still very good in Torment 1 to 3 and will get you into Torment 4. Just takes a little more work than it used to. On the other hand, if you're looking for something else to watch, check out my video on the Kurast Undercity and how to farm it. It's a new mechanic added in Vessel of Hatred. It's pretty fun, and you can get some really awesome loot if you have the tributes. I'll link to that up in the card and down below. But that's going to be about it for me today. At this point, my build feels pretty darn min-maxed, to the point where I don't think gear changes are going to make a meaningful difference, at least for the content I'm running. And so I'm at that point where either I'm going to call it a season, or I'm going to explore other builds. Haven't quite decided what I'm going to do yet, but if there's any other builds on the Spiritborn that you're particularly interested in, maybe you leave them down below. Then, do be sure to get subscribed, ring that notification bell, and look out for future uploads that might contain one of those builds. So, with all that said, thank you very much for watching to the end. I'm glad you've enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.